Good day. Once more, I'm going to provide my own update and commentary on the current state of the Ukrainian crisis and the events of the last 2 days, where there's been quite a lot of diplomatic activity and some activity on the military front. I'm going to touch on the last first because it is obviously the part of the Ukrainian crisis that attracts the most attention. This is the information that has come from Turkey that two US Arleigh Burke destroyers are now transiting the Bosphorus and entering the Black Sea. This is something which has attracted a lot of attention, and in the days leading up to this movement, the United States had given information to the effect that these two warships were entering the Black Sea as a show of force in support of Ukraine in light of the build-up which is happening on the Russian side by the Russian military close to Ukraine's border. Now, I'm going to say straight away that the US claim that this is a response to the Russian build-up is simply untrue. The Turkish authorities have confirmed that the request to Turkey, necessary under international law in accordance with the Montreux Convention, from the United States for permission to transit these two warships through the Bosphorus came 15 days before. In other words, it is connected to the Ukrainian build-up that preceded the Russian build-up. The United States was sending these warships, or intending or planning to send these two warships to the Black Sea, not in response to the Russian build-up along the Ukrainian border, but in support of the Ukrainian build-up along the contact line. Now, the purpose of these warships is not to launch any missiles against Russian troops. The United States would never do such a reckless and irresponsible thing. When US warships have sailed close to Syria and have launched missile strikes against Syria, the Pentagon has been extremely careful to ensure that those missiles were launched against Syrian or Iranian positions, not against Russian ones. The purpose of these two warships, if they have a military purpose, as opposed to just a symbolic one, is to carry out intelligence and surveillance with all the very powerful electronic and radar systems that they possess, and to help the Ukrainians with command and control. The Russian move will already have countered the presence of these two warships. We are already hearing from the OSCE that there is extensive electronic jamming taking place in eastern Ukraine. Apparently, GPS is only working sporadically there. GPS locators are only working sporadically there. And the Russians possess all the electronic means at their disposal to counter any attempts by these two warships to provide assistance in that form to the Ukrainians. So these ships, the movement of these ships, is in effect made redundant by the Russian move, and in fact has been made in effect obsolete by that move, and has been repackaged by the US authorities as a show of support for Ukraine in response to the Russian move in order to disguise its original purpose. Now, having disposed of this, I'm going to say something very briefly about the military situation in the Donbass. I am not a military expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I have been reading reports by some people who are, including Scott Ritter, who is a former US military officer, and Anatol Lieven, who, though he is not a military officer, is, as I understand it, somebody who has worked with the military closely before. Both of them say the same thing, that NATO and the United States military in Europe are in no position to send troops to Ukraine in anything like the necessary force to support Ukraine in the event of a showdown with Russia. There simply are not enough US troops or NATO troops in Europe to do that in an effective way. Any US forces that were sent to Donbass or Ukraine in support of Ukrainian troops would be rapidly overwhelmed by the vastly more powerful Russian forces that can be deployed to this region. So that is simply not going to happen, and that idea really should be dropped. What the Ukrainians and the US were intending to do when they deployed their forces to eastern Ukraine is something which is still uncertain, but whatever it is, in the event of a Russian counterattack, there is no prospect of the United States military becoming directly involved. By the way, Scott Ritter also says that not only does the United States lack the ground forces to intervene in a war in Ukraine, it also lacks the air assets to do so also. He points out that even the most sophisticated US fighter aircraft, the F-22 and F-35 fighter jets, have never operated in a combat zone dominated by the exceptionally sophisticated air defense system that the Russians have deployed in massive density along the Ukrainian border, and that to deploy these air forces and air assets in a fight along that border would be in effect suicidal. So it's simply not going to happen. Let us turn to the far more important information, diplomatic news that there has been over the last few days. Firstly, we've had a number of strong statements from the Russians. To begin with, we've had a comment from Dmitry Kozak, who is President Putin's deputy chief of staff, and who is, by the way, Ukrainian. He has said that if there is a war in Ukraine and if there is the risk of Ukrainian civilians being killed in large numbers, then Russia will intervene to protect them. He has put it in this way: everything depends on what the scale of fighting will be. If there is, as the president says, a Srebrenica, Kozak is referring to the incident, the episode during the Yugoslav war when the Serb forces captured a town and carried out a massacre there. We will be forced to stand up for ourselves. And that is a fairly clear warning that Russia will respond if there is an attack in eastern Ukraine, which threatens civilians, including those civilians who are, of course, Russians. And in fact, we've had more statements to that effect from Peskov, who is Putin's spokesman. The situation on the contact line has been extremely unstable. The dynamics of the situation and the dynamics of behavior of the Ukrainian side create a threat of the resumption of large-scale hostilities. The Ukrainian side, and this is evidenced by a variety of statements, does not completely reject the idea of solving its own problem with the southeast of Ukraine by military means. If the hostilities resume, and if there is a possibility that the Srebrenica-type catastrophe might repeat itself, and President Putin has said so earlier, not a single country in the world will stand aside, or countries, including Russia, will be taking measures to prevent such tragedies from happening again. Now, those were Peskov's words, and note the words, all countries, including Russia, of course he means primarily Russia, will be taking measures to prevent such tragedies from happening again. There was then by the way, in a press conference, the press conference where Peskov made these comments, a follow-up question from certain Ukrainian journalists about what exactly Russia would do under such circumstances, and Peskov then repeated the words, the reference to Srebrenica. If Srebrenica repeats itself in southeastern Ukraine, all countries of the world, all civilized countries of the world, will do everything they can to prevent a catastrophe from happening. There is a necessity to prevent mass civilian casualties. So that is quite clear that from the Russians, from Peskov and from Kozak, that in the event of an attack, the Russians will take steps to protect civilians, and that they will act decisively to that purpose in such an event. And I think that is now conclusive. I don't think anybody disputes it. I would add that one other important Russian official, has also spoken, and that is Nikolai Patrushev, who is the powerful secretary of Russia's Security Council, a very important official indeed, a full member of Russia's Security Council, and Putin's most senior spokesman on defense and security matters, and Putin's key advisor on those matters. He fulfills, by the way, a comparable or analogous role to the national security advisor of the President of the United States. Anyway, Patrushev said that the following, when asked about whether Russia plans to attack Ukraine, he said, "We aren't harboring such plans, but we are following the situation closely. Any concrete measures will be taken depending on how the situation develops." And that was said by Patrushev in an interview with Kommersant newspaper in Russia. So I think we can take it now as conclusively confirmed that if there is a Ukrainian attack on eastern Ukraine, the Russians will respond, and they will act decisively to prevent what they say would be a humanitarian catastrophe from taking place. In other words, they would respond to prevent the two Donbass republics, the two breakaway Donbass republics, from being overrun. Now, the Donbass republics have themselves been speaking, and the leader of one of them, the more important one, Dmitry Pushulin, who heads the Donetsk People's Republic, gave a lengthy press conference, over the course of which he said that if there was a Ukrainian attack on the two Donbass republics, it would be repulsed, and then the military of the two republics would launch a counterattack, and that would not stop at the border of the existing border or ceasefire line of those two republics. In other words, he is talking not just about a defensive resistance to the Ukrainian military in the event of a Ukrainian attack. He is talking about a large-scale counter-offensive. Obviously, he did not say how extensive that counter-offensive would be, whether it would go all the way to Kiev, for example, whether it would stop at, say, capturing the important city of Mariupol on the Black Sea coast, or what exactly it would do. But he made it very clear that in the event of a war, the military of the two Donbass republics, and presumably the Russian military also, would not confine themselves to throwing the Ukrainians back up to the existing ceasefire line. they would go beyond it. Well, all of these moves have led up to what is undoubtedly the single most important event, which is a telephone call between Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany and President Putin of Russia. It's not clear, incidentally, who exactly initiated the call, but it seems it was most probably Merkel. And here I'm going to make an important observation, which is that Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has talked to various Western leaders. He's talked to President Biden of the United States. He's talked to Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO. He's talked to Prime Minister Boris Johnson of Britain. He's talked to Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada. He has not yet spoken, as of the time of making of this video, to Merkel and Macron, though it is Merkel and Macron, respectively the leaders of Germany and France, who are Ukraine's primary interlocutors in relation to this crisis and indeed to the Donbass conflict generally. That, I think, is interesting, and it begs questions about why Zelensky has not been talking to these two leaders. Most probably, and this is my guess, it is because he does not want to be put under pressure by the Germans and the French to do that which he will eventually have to do, but which he does not want to be seen to do too openly, which is to withdraw Ukrainian troops from the ceasefire, from the contact line. Anyway, Putin has been speaking to Merkel and Macron. He spoke to them more than a week ago, and now he's spoken again directly to Merkel herself. Now, we have two readouts of this conversation, one provided by the Germans, one provided by the Russians. The German one is exceptionally brief and simply says that Merkel asked Putin to withdraw Russian troops from the Ukrainian border as part of a de-escalation there. And I think that is probably, undoubtedly, the case, but clearly an awful lot more was said than just that. By the way, those two, that request, if it was made, seems to have been rejected by Putin because the Russian troops, are still there. But we learn from the Russian readout more of what the two leaders actually said to each other. And I'm going to read the section on Ukraine. It is, of course, Ukraine that would have dominated the discussion. While exchanging opinions on ways of resolving the intra-Ukrainian crisis, the Russian president and the German chancellor voiced concern in connection with the escalation of tensions in southeastern Ukraine. Vladimir Putin drew attention to the provocative actions of Kiev, which is now deliberately aggravating the situation along the line of contact. Now, note again that Putin refers to the authorities in Kiev as Kiev. He never says in this context the Ukrainian government. As far as the Russians are concerned, the government of Ukraine does not have complete legitimacy because of the way that the Maidan events took place in 2014, which the Russians have always felt was illegal and unconstitutional and has created an illegitimate regime in Kiev. Anyway, those were Putin's words, but then we move from what Putin said to Merkel to what the two parties agreed. And here is where the Russian readout of the Merkel-Putin conversation becomes interesting. This is what it says. The parties noted the need for the Kiev authorities to implement earlier agreements without fail. In particular, those aimed at the launch of direct dialogue with Donetsk and Lugansk and at legally formalizing the special status of Donbass. They urged the parties to the conflict to display restraint and to invigorate the negotiating process in order to fully implement the 2015 Minsk package of measures as the only legal foundation for a peace settlement. They reaffirmed their commitment to further close coordination of Russian and German efforts, including within the Normandy format, between political advisors and foreign ministers. So this is a very strong and clear statement, at least one that's been published by the Russian side, in which it seems that Merkel agreed with Putin that the way to solve the crisis in Ukraine is for Ukraine to do that which it has consistently refused to do, which is to negotiate directly with the leaders of the two breakaway republics in Donetsk and Lugansk, and to abide by the terms of the Minsk Agreement of 2015, which not only requires such negotiations, but which also requires special status to be granted by Ukraine to Donbass. This is something that Ukraine has consistently refused to do. This is something that Russia has consistently insisted Ukraine must do, and to Ukrainian dismay, it seems that Merkel agreed with Putin and the Russians about this. Now, one shouldn't bank on that. Merkel has, after all, made all sorts of promises about the situation, the conflict in Ukraine to Putin, and she has never actually acted on those promises. After all, she brokered the Minsk agreement along with Putin, which called for direct negotiations between Ukraine and the two breakaway republics, and she has never done anything to put pressure on Ukraine to fulfill that agreement up to now. But as of this telephone call, she is once again taking a Russian view of the conflict rather than a Ukrainian one, and is calling upon both sides to the conflict, and that includes Ukraine, to display restraint and to invigorate the negotiating process in order to fully implement the 2015 Minsk package of measures as the only legal foundation for a peace settlement. Now, that undercuts completely the Ukrainian position, and perhaps that is the reason for certain statements that have now come out of Ukraine, which point clearly to a de-escalation of the crisis from now on. The reason for those statements is, in my opinion, that Ukraine realizes that without support from Germany, an attack on Donbass is a completely hopeless exercise. Now, the first thing to say is that we've had a statement from Zelensky himself in which he calls for a ceasefire, and these are his words. After months of complying with the full and total ceasefire, we have returned to the need to establish a truce. Recently, Donbass has seen an increase in the activity of enemy snipers who regularly target Ukrainian military positions. 26 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed in Donbass since the beginning of the year. So Zelensky now talks about the need for a truce. And perhaps even more important than what Zelensky has said are the very similar words of an official who, in this respect, is arguably even more important. This is Oleksiy Danilov, who is the Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council. Now, this is Ukraine's highest military command body. It also brings together the most extreme military hardliners in Ukraine, and it is the one which has been pushing most strongly for action to be taken in the Donbass, in Crimea, and which is the source of many of the very belligerent statements which we have been hearing. Anyway, this is what Danilov said in an interview which he gave to a Ukrainian online newspaper. There is a certain intensification of processes today in the proximity of the border with Ukraine. Let's say the Russians have never removed their troops from there. Since hostilities began, they have always kept their troops there and in large numbers. But indeed, there is a certain intensification of all processes today. We, for our part, do not plan any escalation because we value the life of each of our soldiers and want all this to end as soon as possible. The president is doing everything he can. As far as we are concerned, the situation is quite simple. Human life is the highest value. Volodymyr Alexandrovich Zelensky has stressed that. We are definitely not going to engage in any provocative actions against the Russian Federation at this stage. Now, that looks to me like an acceptance by the Ukrainians that an offensive in eastern Ukraine is being called off. Both Danilov and Zelensky appear to be saying that. They are packaging it, of course, as a comment that they want to protect the lives of their soldiers. But the reality is that the political pressure from the Germans especially, but also the Germans and the French, is becoming too strong. The Russian build-up in eastern Ukraine would make an attack by Ukraine on the two Donbass republics suicidal, and the United States has rebuffed all calls for it to intervene directly in the conflict, and NATO has made it clear that it is not interested in this situation in fast-tracking Ukraine's membership of NATO. So it seems to me that the Ukrainians are now switching from a position of belligerence and confrontation to a rhetorical position which will cover what is, in my opinion, almost certainly a full-scale retreat. Now, the big question is how that's going to happen. Ukraine obviously does not want to be humiliated in this situation. And as Merkel said, there will be conversations now between the German and Russian foreign ministers, Mas and Lavrov, and their political advisors, in order to find a way for Ukraine to de-escalate this crisis which it started. But I'm going to harden my view, which I have had throughout this whole crisis, about the unlikelihood of a Ukrainian attack. I think that unlikelihood has now increased considerably. I would now be exceptionally surprised if it happened. Well, that's my opinion. Again, I have to repeat that word of caution I always give, which is that on Ukrainian matters, there is always the risk that things may go wrong and that somebody in Kiev will do some reckless and foolish step and might decide that they will launch some kind of attack which would be disastrous from Ukraine. But frankly and realistically, I now think that is extremely unlikely. I think this crisis is now almost past. We shall see if I am right. As I have said already, the next 2 weeks will be crucial. Thank you for joining me for this program. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. I look for, please also check out his channel. You will find links under this video, and please also check out our other channel where you will see that we do we show our comments with our viewers on our live streams. Check us out on our other platforms, BitChute, Library, and Odyssey. Support us to the extent that you can via PayPal, Subscribestar, and Patreon, and go to our Discord server and look up our shop, or links all below this video. I look forward to you joining me on future programs for this on this channel, and have a wonderful day until then. Thank you.